All right, well, hello everyone, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Chris Marty. I'm the Vice President of Data Analytics and Executive Education at MSCI. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in the event today. You're looking at a screenshot of the Zoom attendee interface, and you should see something that looks like this on your desktop. If you want to switch out of computer audio mode, you can do so by using the audio settings in the Zoom interface, and you can dial back in using your phone, but the default is computer audio. Also want you to know that to minimize distractions and background noise, we've got you muted, and you will remain muted. Your microphone will not work for the entirety of this webinar. And likewise, your camera's off and you won't be able to use your video for the entirety of this webinar. And again, that's just to make sure that everyone can hear our panelists. You do have the opportunity to submit questions to our speakers by typing them into the Zoom Q&A interface that you see on the slide here. I'd ask you to do so at any time during the presentation, our discussion, so that we can answer your questions as quickly as you can enter them. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists. First of all, Brad Bullard is the GM of safety for Coilplus and has many years of safety experience in the metals industry. Coilplus is an MSCI member company. Also with us is Steve Yates, who's the CEO of Optimum Safety, also a member company, but a partner of MSCI in a lot of our safety programs. And Brian Dudgeon, also with Optimum Safety, is an account executive and a senior safety professional with Optimum. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome. Good to see all of you.
You too.
So let's get started by hitting some of the really kind of core topics that people seem to be interested in these days. And the first one, I'm going to ask this to Brad and to Brian specifically, is what are the most authoritative sources that you guys use to get information about the pandemic and how to get people back into your facilities and how to keep them safe?
Go ahead, Brad.
So the main resource that I use, it's a couple of them actually. CDC is number one. I'm signed up for the daily updates. They've been very good supplying information. I use World Health Organization and also OSHA, but we have 10 facilities, so I depend also on some of the HR resources we have to give me information on state and local regulations, laws that are going into effect, things like that, but hands down CDC.
Do you find that the states differ all that much, Brad, from location to location?
Not really. There's not a lot of difference that I've seen. Some, of course, opened up earlier than others, but they're following the same line for the most part.
And I would mirror what Brad says. CDC by far has been the best all around. And there's been some joint CDC, OSHA guidance that's been put out, so we look to that. We've also found a few of the public health agencies in different jurisdictions have had some useful, they're mandatory in their jurisdictions, but we've taken them on as best practices for our clients. LA has done some stuff. Oregon has done some stuff with logging visitors into sites. So we've taken those ideas and turned it into best practices.
Interesting. So you're actually leveraging information across the states and locations and making it consistent.
Absolutely.
Okay, so screening. How are you screening employees, Brad, and are you?
Yeah, we do screen employees. We have a form that they have to answer questions on, especially if they've traveled. They have to tell us, it's almost mirrors the visitor's form. They have to answer questions. We ask them to let us know what they're doing, where they've been, things that they've done, so that we can limit the risk to the rest of the workforce.
Do you do any kind of temperature screening at all as people come in and out of your facilities?
we are doing employees. We test them first thing in the morning. Our protocol is for employees to self-test at home. When they get to work, they report that to their supervisor. The supervisor records that. If they did not, or there's a question about it, we do test them with a touch-free hour thermometer.
Okay. But for the most part, it sounds like they're kind of on their own recognizance in terms of reporting in and saying, look, I took my temperature this morning or whatever. And
I think for the most part, I would say that testing in the plant.
Have you had anyone test positive or had to do anything in that regard for the last month or so?
Yeah, we did have some exposure in one of our facilities, and we started working on this at the end of February and into March. We started having a daily conference call 5 days a week with the presidents, HQ representatives. So first thing we did is we worked out a bunch of different scenarios that we would put in place. But we did have some people test positive. Our first thing was to close the plant down, quarantine anyone that was exposed to that person, and have the plant cleaned. Originally, when CDC recommended 3 days of closure, and it got down to where 24 hours was enough. But we did, beforehand, we called our local cleaning services. All the plant managers called the local cleaning services to make sure that the people they were using could accomplish the task. If they could not, we looked for a second source for that. And it worked out really well in the facility that we had the exposure. So it tested our protocols, our procedures, and they really worked well. So we were very pleased. We did also actually have 4 people out with COVID, and we quarantined 14 people that could have come into close contact. And it was very well.
That was going to be my question, is that does that have the effect of increasing employee confidence levels in your guys' ability to handle the situation?
Absolutely. I think that we had a scare at another facility. It turned out it was a negative case. But yeah, I think that it built up the confidence in people. It lowered the anxiety of people. Now, there's still always going to be some people that are scared of this, and with good reason. But yeah, I think it played a big part in that.
Just to Brian and Steve, are you guys finding similar things across your customer base that a good solid process and a procedure in place makes a big difference with employees?
Yeah, I would say that, there's a lot of misinformation out in the media, and a lot of people that are very concerned. So we're finding a really stringent program within the employer helps to educate the employees, make sure that they understand effectively how to control and mitigate the risk. And then when the employer has as you've drawn out here, Chris, if they have a good mitigation strategy, a good quarantine strategy, and so on, it really helps to bring the employees' concern levels down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would echo it as well. And we like to keep in mind and help our clients remember that it wasn't all that long ago. A lot of businesses were struggling to find talented employees. That was one of the greatest concerns. If you'd asked people November, December last year, what's one of your greatest concerns going forward? It's finding enough employees.
Right.
So during this time, you want to give your employees the confidence that you know what you're doing, that you're not putting profits ahead of their safety. And a lot of that has to do with communication. I don't know that you can over communicate during this time, because the absence of communication, people make up their own narratives. So you tell them what you're doing. Here's our plan. Here's how we're executing it. And you keep them up to date on it all the time. And that just lets them become more comfortable that you're not, risking them in order to operate.
I agree, Brian. Communication is key. Absolutely.
So on top of communication, let's talk about PPE for a couple of minutes. Brad, what kind of PPE are you using to protect employees in your facilities?
We are supplying, we have KN95 masks, and we also have surgical masks that we're supplying. We're supplying nitrile gloves. We're supplying hand cleaners. Anything that makes a employee or person feel safe, we're doing our absolute best to supply it to them. If you want a mask every day, we have a supply now that we can do that. So those are the major ones, though. As we spoke earlier.
Can you, just in case someone listening isn't sure, what is a KN95 mask versus an N95 mask?
A KN95, when I check the specs out on a KN95 is something made outside of the US. An N95 meets the specs, and a KN95 meets the specs also, but it's manufactured, say in China. That's the ones that I received, that's where they were made. And that's why the K, because I was curious the same thing when we first started this. So it's made outside the US.
Okay. Do you know who manages the specs for the different kinds of masks? Is that an OSHA, FEMA?
I'm going to say it's probably OSHA CDC.
Okay.
Didn't check that, but I do have a efficiency rating chart of the different types of masks.
Chris, I could speak to this a little bit. 3M's got a really good technical bulletin that they put out in January of 2020, and it compares KN95, which it's a Chinese standard. So whereas we have the requirements that it be NIOSH approved for the use in the US, they have their own entity, and you have to manufacture to that specification. There's also FFP2s, which meet the EU standards. There's P2s, which are for Australia and New Zealand. Korea's got a version, and so does Japan. But if you look into the technical specs, they are all very similar. They all are pretty protective, and CDC has put out some guidance to indicate, for purposes of COVID-19 exposure, in the absence of availability of N95s, that these would be good substitutions.
Okay, got it. Thank you for that, Brian. That's really helpful. Have you had any trouble getting people to use PPE when you require them to use PPE? Any of you, Brad? Let's start with you.
There's been a little hesitation. I think as the states required it, people began using it. With any PPE, people want it to be comfortable. It's made more for protection, right? So you have to learn how to use the PPE where it doesn't cause another safety hazard. So there's some hesitation. There is still some hesitation to have people wear it. And I get my feedback from our plant managers.
Okay, got it. So this is to all of you, but maybe Steve, you could take the lead here. If a company is requiring PPE, and if there are one or more employees who just absolutely refuse to use it, what are the levers that a company can put in place to make that happen? Can you kind of enlighten us on the best way to handle that kind of situation?
Yeah, it's a tricky situation, especially. I read so I'm not an attorney, right? I just want to write that disclaimer over this. Nobody on the call is an attorney, so we're not giving legal advice, because some of this crosses into the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it has all kinds of implications in labor law, and I don't have the expertise, but I can tell you that from a general standpoint, if you've done a job hazard analysis in any workplace and you've determined that there's a requirement for a particular type of protective equipment for the employee to wear to be safe, and the employer refuses to wear it, the guidance I read yesterday suggested asking the question, are you refusing to wear this because of some sort of a medical limitation? And then if the answer to that is yes, then there's a whole series of prescribed methods to go down that I'm not familiar with, and I wouldn't want to try and advise her. It would be a a labor attorney who would be able to help with that. But if the employee just refuses to wear it because, they don't want to wear it, it's uncomfortable, that type of thing, you try to make accommodations to get different styles, so that they can wear something that's as protective as what you've determined is the requirement in your workplace. And if they're not going to wear it, then you wouldn't allow them to work in that workplace. And that's where, again, a good labor attorney is going to advise you on the ADA and, how far you can go down that road. There's also guidance on, and I'm not familiar with the term right now, but it's the act that was originally brought in that allows people to take time away from work due to high-risk medical conditions and so on. So that act kicks in. And
FMLA.
Yeah, it's
FML, Family Medical Leave Act.
Family Medical Leave Act, yeah.
Yeah. So, but there's some specific provisions related to COVID-19 on not necessarily self-determination of self-quarantine, but that there's a medical concern for it. And there's all kinds of then pay considerations. And, and I know we've likely got folks from north of our border and south of our border here with Canada and Mexico, and I'm sure that there's provisions there that are slightly different as well.
Have you encountered a situation where a company has started a disciplinary process when an employee refuses to wear PPE and it's a requirement as part of the job?
Absolutely. That's a very common practice from a safety standpoint, not just with COVID-19, but we deal with a lot of people who are using spray coatings, where employees are required to wear filtering face pieces, half mask rubber or full face, even up to supplied air respirators, or what would be considered a respirator also, an N95 for certain exposure limits. And when we have employees wearing those, they need to be trained on their use and limitations. And one of the limitations is facial hair. So employees with a lot of facial hair can't wear a respirator like that because it breaks the seal. And that's a common disciplinary issue with a PPE style use. And that then the employer is required to issue disciplinary action to enforce. If they wouldn't do that, they would be subject to an OSHA citation if OSHA watched the employee using it incorrectly.
Thank you. Brad, is there anything different that you have had to take in consideration in regard to your employees who are driving trucks? Is there anything unique there that you have to think about?
Our truck drivers, and we just have a couple of facilities that have trucks. Our facilities, they follow our protocols. And when they go to a customer, they will follow our protocols unless the customer is more strict. And then we accommodate whatever that restriction is as far as their entry exit to the facility.
If it's not your truck driver, I'm assuming then you're leasing?
Yes, we do. We lease vehicles. They are our drivers.
Okay.
If we have trucks coming into our facility, we have a couple of different protocols we're using. Some of our facilities are using a fax copy machine to the driver makes a copy of the bill of lading. The receiving guy takes that so that there's no touch directly from each person. The drivers stay in their trucks. They are required to wear masks. We rented portable toilets for them, put that in so that they do not come into our facility and go into our facilities. They are self-contained, so to speak.
Do you accept any visitors at all these days?
Not right now. Only essential. If it's someone that, if a crane's down or something like that, or it's a meal claim that has to be taken care of, then we will accept those visitors. But just someone showing up without an appointment, we do not. We actually made a list of essential, non-essential visitors.
Okay. All right.
Chris, that's something we have been advising our clients on as well, is to take a critical look at your relationships and things like the local Boy Scout troops wanting to tour a facility. No, that's not essential in this time frame. Someone wanting to do a sales call on your organization that you don't have a relationship, but they want to save you money by selling you whatever it is, that those are the types of things that you should exclude for the time being. But you do have critical relationships, like Brad indicated. We're not all self-contained. If a critical piece of equipment goes down, you have to, you either forego the use of the equipment or you let somebody in. So initially we were hearing some clients were taking a really hard view of nobody from the outside gets in, but that's not sustainable for any period of time. So rather than being black and white, off or on, go ahead and roll up your sleeves a little bit and do what Brad's organization did and look at your relationships. And one of the things, of course, that we run into is sometimes our safety professionals from Optimum are viewed as visitors, although in a lot of instances, we are a critical portion of an organization's safety system. So in lieu of having more resources internally, they may have chosen to outsource some of those resources to us. So when you choose to exclude people like that, it would almost be like excluding people that are doing preventive maintenance on a technical piece of equipment. Do you really want to take that chance that you're not doing what you should do to maintain the health of your equipment, or in this instance, the health of your safety management system?
Got it. So my next question is to Steve. Steve, I'm going to bring up OSHA because I think that may be on some folks' minds. And by the way, we don't have any questions yet, so I encourage folks on the call to please go ahead and type in your questions, because we're gonna prioritize your questions above the ones that we have pre-prepared here. OSHA, Steve, do you have any idea how OSHA is acting toward exposures in the workplace thus far?
Yeah, it's really really a great question. We've had a number of just kind of general OSHA culture right now. We've had a number of clients or people that we've come into contact with recently that have had reportable incidents in their plants, which normally could trigger an inspection. And what we're finding is that OSHA is categorically not coming out to investigate those incidents right now. They are conserving resources and sending the quick response letter that the employer can fill in on their own. However, what we are seeing is certain regions and jurisdictions coming out to investigate COVID-19 complaints. So OSHA generally has put guidance out where they're refocusing their enforcement efforts towards the COVID-19 cases. And then we're finding states like Oregon has been pretty active with citing, coming out on the complaints, but citing meatpacking facilities and other facilities where there's a tight concentration. You've probably seen some of this on the news.
Yeah.
Or where companies are experiencing a number of complaints from employees. So back to what we talked about earlier, really important to keep your employees comfortable with the way you're treating them. Nevada's also had some citation activity, mainly with the construction arena, where they're watching employees working on casino construction, where they're in close proximity and no masks. But again, that's visible to the public, and they're probably receiving complaints. Our office is engaged in an investigation here in Illinois, where an employer had a complaint on a COVID case, and actually Brian from our office is handling working with that employer.
Thank you. Do you know if they've cited anybody?
So we do know of the citations in Nevada.
Okay.
And other than that, we're hearing anecdotally a couple of areas where they might be citing, but their main focus has been in the healthcare arena, nursing homes, making sure that the staff is being protected and so on. And we just don't have our finger on the pulse of that industry as tight So I've not, I don't have any confirmed citations there.
Okay. Brian, I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and it's really specifically back to the idea of communications and things like that. Have you done any specialized training now that this pandemic has popped up, this kind of black swan event, related to employee training? Is there anything that people should be doing?
Yes, we've held a couple webinars just to help educate our client base in general, but that's not, I think your question might be more specific to employee training.
Yes.
Yes. So we've developed some training. We've partnered with another firm that provides some learning management content. So we host a couple pieces of training on our learning management system. One is pointed towards all employees that gives them the background. What is COVID-19? It helps kind of dispel some of the myths and misinformation that's out there. And it walks through, what are the good protective measures and a lot of very common sense stuff. So we offer that. That goes out to all employees of our clients. And then we also developed a more specific training session for supervisory or managerial people that have responsibilities around COVID exposure control. So, and there we implemented some of the requirements from the LA region, where there's specific requirements that a supervisor go around and prepare a checklist every day and go through and say, are people social distancing? Are they wearing face coverings? So to prepare that supervisor or manager for those duties, it's important to inform them as well via training. In addition to those learning management platforms, more like a video type training, we've also developed a number of Toolbox Talks that are just one-pagers, and they're little nano training sessions, and they're really intended for a supervisor to have a discussion with some of their employees at the start of a shift, traditional toolbox type concept. And so we offer those as well, and it's a chance to reinforce those key messages around social distancing, hand washing, what to do if you're feeling ill, how to report it, and so on. And the idea is you just keep cycling through those as we work our way through this pandemic. How many more weeks do we have? Who knows?
Yeah. Brad, I noticed you were nodding your head at some of the stuff Brian was talking about. What's been your experience with all that? Are you doing those kinds of things, I would assume?
Yeah, so when we first started, we developed the different policies and procedures, and the plant managers should be getting that from their presidents. And then when we have meetings online, thanks to Optimum, we have a safety leadership team meeting and a safety team meeting, and disseminate that information out to them. I'm always on the lookout for new posters put out by any organization, OSHA and CDC mostly, hand washings, social distancing, things like that. And of course, we have a travel ban, so you're talking to the different managers there at the facility to make sure that that's happening. And so far, I've had no complaints.
I have a question, Brad, that I find interesting. Maybe some of the other folks on the call do too. But how important is it that a manager get out and get in front of their employees in this situation? Is it more important than ever or less?
No, I think it's more important than ever. I think it's always important, but right now, there's so many changes that occur almost on a daily basis. There's so many myths that occur. And I think it's very important for our corporate office and even local offices via their health department communicate these things to the employees so that everybody is hearing the same message. They're not going home and hearing 14 or 15 different stories on it. The same message is put out throughout our facilities. Very important.
There's a question that just came in this regard, so I'm gonna stick with this line of questioning for a second. But have you, either you folks from Optimum or Brad, have you developed specific new policies to cover the pandemic? And if so, now you've mentioned a couple of them, right? But I'm assuming that there are additional things that you've done. Brad, you just mentioned a travel ban. Anything else like that?
Yeah, we have, so we use a biometric clock. It's a fingerprint clock. So we have stopped using that. We either have the supervisor sign employees in, or we have we use ADP, not plugging for ADP, but we have a security, I forget what the technical word is, but it's a gate. When you reach X point on the facility grounds, you're able to clock in with your phone. So people are using that. We wrote the face mask policy, temperature taking policy, visitors policies, the scenarios and what we would do if a particular scenario played out. So yeah, we've made a lot of changes, and we've just recently, not to get ahead of myself, but we just recently turned out a checklist for our executives to go over, and hopefully we adopt some of these things that we have put into place as best practices, and we adopt them full time. I think that they're very significant and very beneficial to employees and visitors.
Chris, one of the ones that we're advising our clients on too, we took a two-tiered approach. I'll mention that first. One, we developed an infectious disease control program, which is just an addendum to your health and safety manual, however you organize those documents. And that sits in the background all the time. It's out there, and it spans the distance of time. It'll be there 20 years from now. And that tells you all your daily sanitation type things. We all know you clean the restrooms with some frequency and you wipe down the break room table. This codifies it. It puts it into a system. And also part of that plan says you have to monitor for pandemic or major outbreaks of illnesses. And when one happens, then you should develop a specific control program around that disorder. So to supplement it as an appendix to that document, we have a COVID-19 exposure control plan. And it captures a lot of the things that Brad was mentioning. And then one that I think is really important to emphasize with your employees is flexible absenteeism. I know that that's a cost to business to tell somebody stay home and we'll still pay you, but you really have to create a disincentive for employees to come to work sick. Because if you don't do that, they will come in and they'll do it because A, they perceive that, you know, getting a certain production quota is important. B, they don't want to be the wimpy one. C, it hits their bottom line and they're trying to pay their bills. And who knows what their family's financial situation is like. Maybe they've got a family member who's not working. So if you don't create a situation in which they can stay home and make as much when they're feeling ill, they will come in ill. And then you run the risk of it spreading like wildfire through your facility. And you know, if you're doing the temperature checks and they start to feel ill, hopefully you catch it with the temperature checks. But people can come in when they're still asymptomatic. They're starting to feel it a little bit, but they're not running a fever yet. Right. You don't want that person in your workplace.
Brad, what specifically do you guys do if somebody develops a fever or reports in during the workday and says, you know, I'm not feeling well?
We would send them home, ask them to self-quarantine, and seek medical advice. And we would pay them for that day.
What happens to the folks that they were working with?
We tried to go back and trace who they came in contact with, the areas of the facility that they were in contact with. We do have video cameras throughout our facilities, and we can kind of go back and see where someone traveled. If there was close contact for 10, 15, 20 minutes, then that person would be asked to quarantine themselves. That's some of the scenarios that we came up with in the very beginning, early March.
Okay. I want to switch from warehouse and operations to offices for just a minute, because I suspect there are some differences in how you have to handle those two types of workplaces. Brian, what are those differences? And I would imagine social distancing in an office might be more difficult than it is in a warehouse or a production facility.
Yeah, we have, we've got, let's say 50% of our people working from home. It's probably not that high percentage, but quite a few people are working from home so that we're not risking exposure, which opens the offices up to social distance. We're cleaning the touched surfaces. We've got the cleaning crews doing exceptional work there in the restrooms, break rooms, office cubicles, desk, wherever. But I think one of the big things is having people work from home, not creating more exposure possibilities.
Brian, anything to add to that?
No, I think Brad hit it. I mean, I think a lot of people are discovering that employees can be pretty productive from home. And it's important to measure that because you know the question is going to be answered when this is all said and done. You know, if it was okay for me to work at home in April, why is it not okay for me to work at home in October or whatever month we're finally clear of this? So how do you measure productivity? That's not my field, but that's something you got to be looking at and thinking about because you know the question will come up, especially as we get in the next cold and flu season. Let's assume that we have a COVID vaccine by then and that's kind of faded. People are going to start saying, well, you know, when there was a risk of me infecting the office, you wanted me to stay home. Now I'm at risk of infecting the office with my cold. Why shouldn't I stay home?
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. That's an interesting segue into looking a bit into the future to see what might be going on. So, Brad, automation and installing automation to help with the pandemic and going forward. What kinds of things is Coilplus considering doing there?
We're really just starting to look at that. One thing that we are going to trial, I'm expecting a delivery to one of our facilities next week. It's a device that does facial recognition. It records temperature. The person just walks up to it, takes their temperature. If they're all clear, they get a green light. If they have a fever over 100.4, a red light will go off, an alarm, and the supervisor will step in or plant manager will step in and advise the person that they need to go home, but they also need to seek medical attention. Also, there's a device I've been looking at it for a while. This morning, a guy that works for the company, I'm not going to call the name, but it's a device that visitors can come in and check into. It takes a picture of the person, it sends an email or a text to the internal person that they're visiting, but they have a touchless model coming out. The concern in the beginning was where it was an iPad. You would touch it to type your name, things like that, but they are coming out with a touchless. So that's two things that we're looking into. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more items coming out during the remainder of this virus and also afterwards. But we're very high on the technology side of it.
Sounds like you're open to a lot of that kind of thing.
Yes.
Brian, you mentioned this already, but I wanted to talk about working from home. I'm doing it. I've never liked doing it, but I'm starting to get used to it. So is that going to be a new normal? Are we headed down the path of just a lot more people working at home, even after the pandemic?
I certainly think so. I mean, obviously in manufacturing or touch labor situations where you need a person there to perform a task, you need them there. But your payroll personnel or your accounting personnel, depending on the degree of interactions with others and the need to be face-to-face, I think a lot of employers are going to be challenged to try to justify why you need to be in the office every day. And personal experience has been, I've worked from home now with a couple of employers, and I found myself to be very productive first thing in the morning. And I like to get started early and get a bunch of work done right away. It's going to be tough. You look at some of our biggest companies in the US, some of the biggest employers, Google, Facebook, companies like that, they are revisiting their whole policies around work from home. And some of them have long held that collaboration was a very important part of their culture, and they wanted people to come together. And when they start revisiting it and saying, you know what, also spending time not behind the wheel, an hour and a half each way each day in a commute is important as well for family work-life balance. It's going to be difficult for employers. Again, we got to remember, 6 months ago, one of our biggest challenges was attracting employees.
Right.
So 6 months from now, will it be, or maybe it'll be 12 months from now, that'll be one of our biggest challenges. So if you're the employer that says, no, it's over with, everybody come in and you'll be in the office between this hour and this hour every day. If you're rigid on that, will that hurt your ability to retain or attract talent? Maybe.
Brad, you mentioned that Coilplus has about half its office workforce working from home. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that may be a little high percentage. The original plan was that inside sales or customer service, for
Okay.
instance. If you had 6, 3 would work at home this week, and we would switch up like that. So somewhere in that neighborhood is an.
Did you have any trouble at first making that transition, or were people pretty open to it?
I think there was a little hesitation. In some of our facilities, it's heavy paperwork burden where somebody has to get material off of printers, things like that. So there had to be an adjustment period. I think that as we move forward, things are getting better. I know at some of the facilities I've spoken with, it's gotten a lot better as far as people are starting, like Brian said, they're starting to enjoy it, and they're very productive. I know for me, I'm on the road quite a bit, and I've been at home since February the 20th. I'll be glad when the travel ban's lifted because I'd like to go to the facilities, but I find myself very productive throughout the day.
Yeah. Steve, you're a business owner.
Yeah.
So what's your perspective on this one?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I'm hearing Brian and hearing Brad talk, and then thinking about some of the situations we have here, they're all very relevant viewpoints. We have kind of a hybrid work from home, work in the office because of our safety professionals being, traveling and going to different facilities or construction sites. So we've always had this kind of in our mix, but right now, so we have several single mothers that work for us that have children who are not in school, and that also daycare facilities are closed. So these single moms need to be at home. And at the point where we are opening our office back up here over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be asking them to come back into the office, and they're going to be challenged with what do they do with their kids. So we're navigating this kind of just like everybody else on the call, very individualistic with each employee, trying to care for them and make sure that we don't put them in a undue stress situation, and that we're accommodating as much as we can.
There's a question that came in on this topic just now as we've been talking about it. But Steve, let me stay with you and ask you, have you at all thought about just making people work at home? Just to be blunt about it. Look, just work at home.
Yeah, we have. I mean, we've talked about this. We have a pretty collaborative environment here. There's a lot of benefit to the safety professionals being in their work environment, like where you see Brian sitting right now. He's within 15 feet of, on a normal day, within a half a dozen other safety professionals he can bounce things off of. So we really want to restore that. At the same time, we've become very adept at using Microsoft Teams. And I find myself, throughout the day, I'm going to go ahead and give Troy a call on Teams, or, we're able to quickly connect with each other or draw somebody else in by Teams. So kind of the water cooler conversations and the, leaning over somebody's cube to ask them a question, we're finding ways to do that. So jury's still out, but we're trying to be flexible.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I want to go back to one of our original topics real quick, because Brad mentioned a couple of times cleaning facilities and sanitizing. The first question I would have is, Brad, did you have any trouble getting cleaning supplies, PPE? I mean, you can't buy Clorox wipes anywhere, for example. And I'm not saying you use Clorox wipes, but was that a challenge at first back in March?
It was a challenge. Luckily, we had some good relationships. Different facilities did, and they were able to acquire the needed supplies that they had. Our biggest thing was PPE, especially masks in the very beginning, then hand sanitizer. So I think that now it's leveled out to where we're getting supplies, but in the beginning, yeah, it was a job getting supplies into the facility.
Brian, are you guys finding that to be the case among your client base too?
Definitely, and there is a good resource out on the CDC website that refers to the EPA registered cleaners and what they're effective for. So you can go out there and see which ones work, how much contact time is required. So if you run into a brand that maybe isn't as established in your mind and you're not as familiar with it, and you're wondering, is, you know, the salesperson is telling me, or the online description is telling me that this is great for COVID. Is it really? You can verify that back against that list, and then just be assured that you know what you're buying, as long as it's not counterfeit, that what you're buying, if it's a brand you're not familiar with, whether or not it's effective for COVID.
Okay. So we have another question that just popped in, and I'm going to let anybody who's willing answer this one. But how do you balance the science that supports changes to your policies and procedures versus the employee perception? Because you guys have mentioned this already. There are a lot of different versions of things out there available to people, right? It's not just the large news media, but it's social media, and a lot of sources that may not be as reliable. How do you deal with that kind of thing?
So I'll take part of that, Steve.
I thought I'd stumped you all for a minute there.
Well, I think we're all waiting on the other person, but CDC, what CDC sends out, we take a hard look at, and because you're right, there's a lot of myths out there. There's a new story every day. CDC seems to be very grounded in their guidance that we use, their cleaning guidelines, employee guidelines. They're a big resource for us.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, we run into this too with employees, you know, so for us, we're a little secondhand because we're dealing with the client who in turn is dealing with their employee. We often have conversations with employees at client locations, but it's not something that we haven't seen before. Sometimes around industrial hygiene, somebody tells you they can taste something in the air, they know it's present, they can smell the asbestos. You know, you can't smell asbestos factually. So, you know, you got to deal with that and understand that for that person, perception is reality. They truly believe that, and offer the science, but also be kind and compassionate in your explanation, and help them if they need to do a little reading on it and self-discover some of the facts around it. But just keep bringing them back to the fact that, you know, at our workplace, we base our rules on, you know, reputable sources like CDC and others. And that's where we're going to keep establishing our rules, and that's what's required. But there's no one ticket with every individual, but generally you can have some success if you just keep working at it and remain compassionate.
Chris, if I can add to that real quick, and Brian, that it's great. I mean, the compassion of trying to understand the perspective of your employee and what they might be hearing out in the media is really good. In addition to that, Chris, I'll just harken back to the webinar that we did last week for MSCI members. Those that are on the call, if they haven't heard that, we had Dr. John Kaler on with us, and that was about the clearest understanding, the clearest description of the virology and how the virus attaches itself or creates a problem with the hemoglobin and the absorption of oxygen. It helped me really clearly understand why this isn't causing pneumonias like other respiratory viruses at the rates that it is. You know, why the ventilators aren't as effective. It's attacking the body's ability to absorb oxygen. That just really helped me put that together. And as a safety professional, it helped me understand, for those that are safety professionals and understand carbon monoxide exposure and how there's similarities in what it does to the systems within the body, in stopping the attachment of oxygen to the blood. So I know that webinar is available on the MSCI website, right?
You stole that from me. Yes, I think
Sorry.
if you go to the MSCI no, that's perfectly fine. If you go to the MSCI website and there's a rotator on the homepage, and there are only two things on the rotator. One is the government stimulus program. The other one is a listing of all the webinars we've done. And it would include the webinar with Dr. Kaler, and you would be able to listen to that. I think it was a good 10-minute description of how this virus is different and how it actually affects the human anatomy in a different way. And I agree with you, Steve. That was an amazing and very useful description of why this is such a different situation.
Yes, yeah. I think that you asked earlier about employee training. Brian mentioned the online LMS content we have, and that does a nice job of giving some visuals and a video about it. But that section of that webinar, for that to be screened up for employees to hear, you know, there was a viral video on YouTube with two doctors that went around, and it had millions and millions of views, and I think that was debunked as a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, that was the two doctors in California who, yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah, you know, this is what you're trying to combat as an employer with 200 employees who, you know, you're telling them that wearing a mask and going into a facility is okay. You know, Dr. Kaler actually explains why that is the case, and yet where the limits are and so on. I think it's really a good tool to combat that.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for mentioning the fact that you can go get that on the MSCI website, because you can. So we're coming kind of toward the end of the webinar. Do any of you guys have anything that you'd like to mention that we have not talked about that you think is important? Because I've been asking a lot of questions, but I want to make sure that you guys are the experts. If we missed something, I'd like to get it covered before we all sign off here today.
Yeah, I've got one topic, Chris, that you and I talked about that we haven't actually hit yet, and I want to make sure that we just talk about this real quick. When it comes to OSHA exposure, so I've been kind of the one talking about the OSHA issue here. So when we teach employers about how to systemically avoid exposure to OSHA citations, we use an analogy of a four-legged stool. We talk about building a four-legged stool with programmatic documentation, making sure you have a good program to cover the exposure. Second is training the employees, making sure that the employees understand that. So you've heard about the training elements. You heard Brian talk about the infectious disease control program and COVID-19 response plan. And then the training elements that both Brad and Brian have touched on. The third is the inspection of the workplace, that the supervisors would do kind of the checklisted inspection that Brad spoke about. The fourth leg of that stool you touched on earlier, which was the disciplinary action policy and corrective action to get the employee to follow the procedure, the training, and the inspected deficiencies then. So if the employers are following that four-legged stool and they give their attorney all four legs of that, then the attorney can defend any OSHA citation. It's called an affirmative defense for an isolated employee misconduct if OSHA walks in and sees somebody not following the proper policy. If, like with a four-legged stool, you're missing a leg, the stool falls over. So it's just a really good way for people to remember policy, training, inspection, and disciplinary action. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Brad, anything else?
Yeah, I would add something to what Steve just said. So I've attended several webinars by NIOSH and also OSHA, or someone presenting something for OSHA. And keeping your records, making sure you're documenting what you're doing, showing good faith. If you do happen to get an OSHA inspection, it seems to be that that's going to be something OSHA really investigates deeper as people are out and about anymore. So I would recommend that you document everything that you're doing as far as mitigating your risk to COVID-19. It's very important. That and communications.
Ryan, you get the last word.
Okay, I hope not to disappoint. We've seen some political action just recently. There's a lawsuit that got filed trying to force OSHA to develop a standard on COVID-19. And if you want to know what that standard may look like if OSHA's hand is forced, I think a good guide to look to is what OSHA and CDC jointly released for the meatpacking and poultry industries. If you go look at that, that gives you an idea what OSHA might be thinking and what they might include in a standard. So it's a starting point. And by the way, there's nothing in there that's earth-shattering. It's all of the good things that we've already talked about. So I don't know that we're going to see anything coming out of left field that nobody's ever heard of, and that's what OSHA is going to latch on to as a critical element of your response plan. I think it's going to be the things we've talked about and just good execution of them.
Hey, Chris.
Yes, sir.
One last point on what we're talking about with all of these OSHA concerns and making sure we're following the regulations. One thing that we have not seen yet is the plaintiff's attorneys coming after employers for exposure, the illness itself, and loss of wages or loss of life. But unless Congress and the Senate pass something that says that there are no there's immunity for employers, which I've heard both sides of that story. Watched an interview with the former head of OSHA where he was vehemently defending that should not be the case because of employers who disregard safety. That opens up the wild west for plaintiffs' attorneys to go after employers and unfortunately consultants for any of this type of exposure. So for the employers, make sure you're thinking about that. If the care of the employee isn't enough, the OSHA citations and the litigation should add a level of fervor to your requirement.
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that, Steve, because MSCI is monitoring that situation.
Okay.
And is pushing for some liability protections for employers of the kind that you sort of just talked about. So if you go to the MSCI website, you'll find that information there as well. We're following that pretty closely. Yeah,
it's really, really good that MSCI follows and advocates on behalf of the members for that, because it's extremely devastating downstream.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you. I want to thank the panelists, Steve Yates, Brad Bullard, Brian Dudgeon, for putting up with all my questions today. It's very much appreciated. We had a pretty big audience. They didn't ask a ton of questions, but when we do our feedback surveys after each one of these webinars, this is one of the topics that consistently comes back as something people want to hear. How are other people doing these things? And so we've done a series of 3 COVID-19 related safety webinars now, this being the 3rd. I want to thank everybody in the audience for participating today and let you know that within 24 hours, you are going to receive an email from us, and it's going to ask you to fill out a post-webinar survey. So you can tell us how we did, number 1. Number 2, what are some of the other topics that you want MSCI to focus on and do webinars on in the future? So we really rely on your feedback from these post-webinar surveys. So please take the time to fill that out. It's only 5 questions, so it takes probably less than a minute to do. So this has been one of that ongoing series of webinars. We have one later this week on helping service centers with their commoditization of product issues. That's semi-related to what's going on right now, but it's also just an interesting topic in general. And so we appreciate everybody's participation. Again, thanks for being involved, and we will see you later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. Great job.